Advancing into Raqqa, a US-led coalition continues its assault on Daesh's self-proclaimed Syrian capital. But are civilians paying the highest price? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the fight for Raqqa. Raqqa has been Daesh's de facto capital since it captured the city nearly 3 years ago. But could it be losing its final stronghold in northern Syria? As we speak, a coalition of Syrian fighters, YPG militants and US Special Operations Forces are pushing further into the city. The three-pronged assault on Raqqa follows days of heavy bombing from the air. If the battle for Mosul in neighboring Iraq is any guideline, the fighting could take months. And no matter which side wins, the biggest loser may be Raqqa civilians. Despite most residents having already fled, more than 100,000 remain trapped inside the city. And if Daesh is pushed out, who will control Raqqa after the terror group has fled? Shoaib Hassan reports.
The fight many in the region have been gearing for is here. SDF militants, primarily made up of the PKK Syrian wing, the YPG, are pushing into Daesh's self-proclaimed capital, Raqqa, along with Bashar al-Assad's forces. That's why the fighters say air support is crucial, and it's being provided here by US warplanes. But a recent video of the air raids suggests that the US-led forces have used incendiary devices containing white phosphorus. The use of that chemical on urban settlements is banned under international law. But the blurred lines of conflict in Syria mean such rules are rarely enforced. US officials have neither confirmed nor denied the use of the substance. But the surge in fighting has triggered an exodus. Desperate refugees trying to escape before the worst of the fighting begins.
As members of the Raqqa City Council, we received more than 200,000 refugees from the residents of Raqqa. We provided them with tents, relief items, water and bread. But there's an extremely large number of people, and we expect to receive hundreds of thousands more in the near future.
It's all building up to another major humanitarian catastrophe. To the coalition, the price is worth it. The end of Daesh as a major force in Iraq and Syria. Raqqa has been Daesh's self-proclaimed capital since 2014. Located in northern Syria, the city is close to the border with Turkey. To its west lies territory controlled by the Syrian regime, and now the SDF has besieged the city from the north and east. That's why those fleeing take the route southwards across the Euphrates River. But it's a treacherous trek as Daesh controls the way to ensure safe passage for its own leaders. Coalition airstrikes have already struck boats here said to be carrying Daesh leaders across the river. But dozens of civilians were also killed when one of the bombs struck a civilian vessel. Rights groups fear this total war strategy is likely to fuel civilian casualties rather than damage the terror group. But the US believes this approach is working.
We've had tremendous success against ISIS in our fight in the Middle East, where we're doing very, very well. We're going to be having a news conference in 2 weeks on that fight, and you'll see numbers that you would not have believed.
On the ground, though, it's still unclear. Will the fight destroy Daesh once and for all? Or will Raqqa civilians end up paying the ultimate price? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by Yahya Al-Aridi. He's a spokesman for Syria's Opposition High Negotiations Committee. And from Paris, Can Kasapoğlu, a defense analyst at EDAM, a think tank focusing on foreign policy and security. And from Paris, Ole Solvang. He's the Deputy Director of the Emergencies Division at Human Rights Watch. Gentlemen, thanks all of you for joining us. Yahya, let me begin with you first. Raqqa is in the process of being taken. That's what people presume. Is that a guarantee that Daesh will fall and Raqqa will be retaken?
Well, there are conflicting reports about what's happening in Raqqa now. Many of them said that Raqqa no longer has Daesh. They somehow evaporated. That's what some reports say. Others really say that due to the fact that the makeup of Daesh originally is foreigners and locals, it is very easy for locals just to change shape, shave, change their clothes, and go into the street, and nobody probably would recognize them. The others who came from abroad just ran away to the south, to other areas where they could be functional. This is not quite confirmed, whether this is true or not, but this is a possibility for the situation there. And you know that there are so many conflicting agendas over there, and everybody is racing to have a say in what's happening in Raqqa and to be declared the liberator of Raqqa due to the fact that it is the capital of Daesh. Now, the most important thing is that Daesh, this monster, is on its way to evaporating. What sort of shape it's going to take in the future, no one knows.
Yeah. And one of the theories is that because so many civilians are being killed, so many people are being displaced in the battle to defeat Daesh, who knows what will come after Daesh, and it might even be worse because the situation on the ground is not great. John, what do you make of the people who are doing the fighting on the ground? Do you like them? Do you endorse them? Do you support them?
Well, first of all, we see some great problems about the U.S. choice of SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, because of the domination of PKK-affiliated YPG. There are many aberrations going on, like SDF, YPG, PKK, but at the bottom line, what I can say is there are two dangerous trends for the national security of Turkey. The first one is there is a huge arms flows from the United States of America and the West into PKK affiliate groups in Syria. So we know that in the region since 2006, the second Lebanon war, we have hybrid warfare threat which can just cripple the conventional superiorities of regular armies. In that sense, we are seeing advanced manpads, advanced personal carried air defense weapons at the hands of PKK. We see anti-tank guided missiles at the hands of PKK. And secondly, and I think more importantly, there is no buyback or take-back vision in the U.S. arms flows to SDF. So we don't know what these weapons will go. We don't know if YPG will keep holding these weapons. And we don't know how much or how many of these weapons will be transferred to PKK. I think that's the main concern in Ankara among Turkish strategic circles now.
Yeah, and there's a big concern from Turkey that those guns might be turned on Turkey if and when Raqqa is taken. What after that? Let's bring in Ole. Ole, tell me, what are your main human rights concerns in terms of the cost of this battle to get Daesh out of Raqqa?
Well, the problem is, of course, that there are still, as far as we know, many civilians left in Raqqa, tens of thousands. You know, there have been reports about even more. And what is really important is that all the fighting parties take the necessary precautions to protect those civilians. And that will include, for example, coalition air forces to take necessary precautions to not to hit or strike civilians, to distinguish between combatants and civilians. It also means, you know, we also are concerned about how people coming out of these areas are being treated, people who have been in ISIS-controlled territory, and there should be proper procedures in place. You know, various authorities, of course, have the right to screen and to look for ISIS fighters and to put them on fair trials, for example. But there shouldn't be sort of a collective punishment of those people in those areas. Yeah. A third big problem we know from other places where ISIS have lost control is the presence of landmines and improvised exploded devices. You know, I saw that myself when I visited Minbij a few months ago. That was a huge problem and something that ended up killing a lot of people. So anybody involved in the Raqqa operations need to raise awareness about this problem and need to put the resources in place to clear residential homes, streets, so that civilians are not killed by these landmines planted by ISIS.
Yeah, here the U.S. commander, Lieutenant General Steve Townsend, said the battle would be, quote, long and difficult. Now, using, say, Mosul in Iraq as an example, many people thought this was going to be really easy. You just go in and you smash these guys up and they're gone, and, you know, they still hold in half the city on the other side of the river, right? Might this get really, really ugly and become a quagmire that sucks in the coalition forces beyond the SDF and all of them, everybody else? Might it suck people in?
Well, it could, but this statement is still less severe than the former statement by President Obama when he said that it would take us about 15 years to finish Daesh. And now he's saying it's going to be long and it's going to be devastating. It's true. And the interesting thing that Oleg has said about civilians, the last thing those parties involved in Raqqa issue and in Syria in general, the last thing they think about is the civilians. You know that the people there are not only between one rock and one hard place, they are between 3 or 4. Because so many people are racing into just getting the honor of defeating Daesh, and in the crossroads, the civilians are paying the highest price. The people of Raqqa now are for about 10 days without water, without electricity, without any sort of safety. Everybody is just concerned with targeting Daesh, and Daesh suddenly, as reports say, has evaporated, just possibly has gone to the south. And this is a game being played, I believe, on the part of the United States, just to get it somewhere to make out of it a problem for the Russians, who are also involved in the Syrian case, you know, as a form of occupation, actually.
May I ask you, how do you feel that even defeating Daesh, who are egregious and absolutely grotesque in everything they do, still leaves Assad, still leaves the war, still leaves all the fundamental problems?
Imran, this is actually, again, consistent with the idea that nobody cares about Syrian people, Syrian civilians. Syrian people are being exposed to certain choices. From the very beginning, the regime said, either Assad or we ruin Syria. Then we got the choice between either Assad or Daesh. Putin recently, a week ago, said that either fragmentation or partition or Assad. So this is the situation Syrian people are facing. Now, if Daesh is defeated, this is to the good advantage of Syrian people in general in the long run, because this excuse, this pretext which is being used for the continuation of the domination of oppression in Syria would be eliminated. At that point, people, the whole world would be faced by the fact that the source of the magnet that brought terrorism into Syria, this is this aggressive regime. Now, at that point, people, the world would really possibly think seriously about finding a real political solution for Syria, not as the situation is today. Russia talks about a political solution, but does war on the ground. The others talk about Iran, for instance, talks about a political solution for Syria, and at the same time, it does war. This is what's happening, and this is why the whole saga, the whole problem, the whole tragedy is going on year after year after year.
John, given that even if you defeat Daesh where they have roots, they might still bite back through lone wolves or people just inspired by them in cities like Istanbul, in cities like London and Paris and so on. Can they ever be defeated? And is that factored into the thinking when the Turkish government's thinking about this, when the UK, when France and all these other countries are thinking about it?
Well, defeat is one thing and annihilation is another. I think we have, if the operations, and it seems the operations will prevail in Raqqa, and I think Raqqa will at least conventionally cleared from Daesh presence, then there are two threats, two trends actually, two risky trends awaiting ahead of us. The first thing is what I call Al-Qaedaization of Daesh, which means like transformation from a self-proclaimed terror state into some kind of like global insurgency, global terrorist campaign, as you have mentioned, and also as we saw in the Western capitals and also population centers in Turkey. And I think the presence of foreign fighters, which is in open source intelligence estimated up to 30,000, and given the very fact that a high proportion of these foreign fighters are coming from the Western countries, is a threat factor in the sense. The second thing is, we see that Raqqa is besieged right now from the west, from the east, from the north, but the southern gateway is still open. And in the south, we see that there are Syrian Arab army formations around Palmyra, but still the geography favors any kind of like Daesh influx into the open desert area of Syria. So it remains to be seen whether we will see Al-Qaedaization or the globalization of Daesh terrorism, let's say, or we're gonna see they're gonna find a new self-proclaimed capital or some kind of safe haven within Syria. There are, of course, like some strategic guidelines to follow in order to predict such trends. First thing is, will we see the continuation of the global Daesh-inspired terror trend? That's the first and foremost strategic parameter that we should just keep an eye on. And secondly, the Syrian Arab Army's operations within Syria and also the Russian Air Force. How the Russian Air Force will be used, what will be their target priorities, what will be their target sets. Will we see more, for instance, cruise missile strikes as recently witnessed from the Mediterranean into Palmyra? But very briefly, I think like we have now two risky paths ahead of us.
Okay, and it's pretty ominous, both of those paths. Ole, Air Wars, who are quite solid with the way they compile their data, they estimated that the minimum number of civilian casualties from US-led coalition strikes in Syria and Iraq was more than 3,800. Now that's approximately 8 times the number that was reported by the coalition. So I ask you, as somebody concerned about human rights, concerned about the human cost of this battle against Daesh, are they inaccurate, the coalition, or are they deliberately downplaying and underplaying the numbers of civilians that are killed in this battle?
You know, it's hard to say. I think what we can say for sure is that they should be doing more thorough and effective investigations. Let me just give you one example that we have been working on. You might remember that back in March, there was a U.S. attack that struck a mosque outside of Aleppo. U.S. authorities have investigated that attack now, and they found that indeed it was a mosque that was struck, but they still seem to have not thoroughly investigated whether civilians or combatants were investigated. And the fact that they didn't even know that they were attacking a mosque at that point, of course, is to us a big sort of danger sign. And it tells us that U.S. forces, coalition forces, should be doing more to make sure that they're taking the necessary precautions to minimize civilian casualties. There are reports that civilian casualties have significantly increased. Some of that can be because we're entering a different phase of the war. We're moving into more urban areas, both in Raqqa and in Iraq. But it doesn't alleviate the coalition and the U.S. of taking all possible precautions to minimize civilian casualties. And we are worried that there might be a relaxation of the rules or the procedures around targeting and making sure that civilians are not killed.
Yes, it's important to get that message out. Yahya Al-Aridi, I asked you the last time if you were optimistic about the future of your country. I had you on set a few months ago. I'm going to ask you again. I'll ask you every time you come on set. Here we are, 6 years on. Are you optimistic, given all of this, about the future of your country?
I am optimistic. I believe in that Syrian spirit, in the Syrian genes. The Syrians have given the world the alphabet and zero upon which these computers are based and functioning. And those Syrian people are still determined for 6-7 years. The whole world is against them somehow, with the exception of few good-hearted people or countries who are supporting them. I believe that Daesh itself, the one we are discussing now, was used most of the time as a pretext to achieve certain agendas. They have certain people, certain countries, certain powers have goals they wanted to achieve, and they use Daesh, they use the issue of terrorism as a whole in order to justify, in order to rehabilitate a regime that has killed its people. Now, as such, I believe that facts are going to be exposed, everything would be quite clear to the whole world, and Syrian people would probably be given a chance once again to come back to life.
Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately I've got to move on, but it's been good to talk to all of you. Yahya Laridi, Jan Kasapoğlu and Ole Solvang, thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the program, is Russia's opposition gaining momentum and stirring fear in the Kremlin? And French President Emmanuel Macron continues to push out the old guard. Is this the new centrist revolution? Russia has been hit by its biggest protests in years. What's causing the latest round of outrage? Corruption. And the man leading the charge against the Russian government is opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Long a thorn in President Vladimir Putin's side, Navalny didn't even get a chance to lead the protests he called for. He was detained by police at his home on Monday. But that didn't stop thousands of Russians who poured out onto the streets all across the country. Yvette McCullough has more.
A rare display of mass defiance. Russians out in force, risking arrest to voice their anger over allegations of corruption at the highest level. Thousands heeded the call of opposition leader Alexei Navalny to take to the streets on Russia Day, with around 180 anti-corruption rallies held across the country. In Moscow, Navalny had permission to hold a demonstration, but the night before, he moved it to a new, unauthorized location. Russian police warned they would take strong action against anyone protesting against the law. An independent NGO, OVD Info, says 825 people were detained in the capital, while around 500 were held in St. Petersburg. But the protest orchestrator never made it. Navalny was detained by police outside his home before it even began. He has been sentenced to 30 days administrative arrest for repeatedly violating the law on staging rallies.
I am very pleased that people came out. I am proud that I am part of this movement in which brave, wonderful people are not afraid to go out on the streets, even under the threat of detention.
These protests were not only a test of Russian dissatisfaction with alleged political corruption, but also one of how much support Navalny still has. In March, he published a report accusing Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev of accumulating a vast private fortune, something Medvedev denies. But this sparked the largest protests Russia had seen since 2012, with more than 1,000 people arrested. The 41-year-old former lawyer is mounting his long-shot bid to unseat President Vladimir Putin in next year's election, mobilizing supporters through social media and appealing to many young Russians.
Everything that has happened again shows us that large masses of people cannot be repressed. We must take part in actions peacefully, but if they won't let us take part, we should still go out and not wait for people's permission.
But what impact will this rare show of domestic pressure really have on President Putin? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Moscow is Oleg Kozlovsky. He's the director of the Vision of Tomorrow Center, a Russian civil society group. And from London, Alexander Nekrasov. He's a former advisor to the Kremlin. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Oleg, let me begin with you. You were on the streets, you were marching, you were protesting. Tell me why you were protesting.
Well, first of all, of course, like many Russians, I despise corruption. I see corruption as a pervasive threat and pervasive problem of Russia. And I want the government to finally go after it in a serious way, not just arresting certain figures who they consider politically dangerous at the moment or unnecessary. And it requires, I believe, a change in the ruling elite in Russia, including the president, the prime minister, the government, etc.
Okay, and you believe, Oleg, that they are unfairly targeting your friend, Mr. Navalny?
Well, Mr. Navalny is the leader of the opposition, the de facto leader of the opposition in Russia. He called for this protest. He was arrested yesterday when he was leaving his apartment and jailed for 30 days without a fair trial, without any witnesses being heard. Of course, we cannot call this a fair trial or legal action on the part of the government. It's just a way to isolate the front runner of the opposition from participating in his presidential campaign.
Okay. Alexander Nekrasov, what's wrong with people protesting against corruption? It's a good thing, right?
I think it's a good thing when people protest against corruption. What I find distasteful is when protesters mix with people who were celebrating Russia Day on Tverskaya Street in the center of Moscow and pretend that all these people were part of the protest. They were not. This was actually quite a nasty thing on the part of the opposition, because you don't hijack peaceful parties and, you know, where children with parents come to see all sorts of entertaining things, and then suddenly groups of protesters start to hijack these celebrations and pretend that it's a massive, massive protest. That I completely deplore. This is not a way to protest.
Okay, so Oleg, did you smuggle yourself into Russia Day protests and pretend as if they were part of your big crowd and disrupt their celebration? That's the charge. Did you do it?
Well, what I could see is that the majority of people around me, they were clearly part of the protest crowd. We did have, there was a celebration there. It was in a bit of a different part of the street, and it was clearly smaller than the number of people who went to protest. In any case, people who dislike corruption have the same rights to gather in their home city as the people who don't care about corruption. So I don't see why some people coming there is legal while others is hijacking.
Okay, but it might not be that they don't care about corruption. They were just celebrating Russia Day. Be that as it may, you sent us some cell phone footage that you took. I just want to call that up. James, if you can call that up, let's talk through some of it. I'll tell you what we're looking at so you can tell me what was going on during that footage. Let's have a look at your cell phone footage, Oleg, and let's see what we're seeing here. I see something that looks like a bus. Policemen taking people, putting them onto the bus. They look like riot police. Oleg, do you feel they were brutal? Did they rough you guys up?
Well, they clearly used too much force because nobody, at least nobody whose detentions I saw was trying to resist. Nobody had any weapons. Nobody tried to fight with the police, to clash with it. They were arresting very young people, old people, middle-aged people. They were using excessive force, clearly. Several people are at hospitals now, including a female activist, one of the leaders of an opposition party, who was punched in the face and suffered concussion. I was filming the scene. I wasn't holding any signs or anything. I was just pushed on the ground, knocked down, and I injured my ankle. And I believe there are dozens of people who sustained some injuries. So this was clearly not justified by the way these people could pose any threat whatsoever to public safety.
Okay, and it's good that you sent us that footage, and we thank you for that footage. Oleg, Alexander Nekrasov, I want to focus a little bit on Navalny now. From the outside, it looks as if this man is a threat to the state, if the state deems him a threat enough to arrest him on the morning of a protest day. It seems as if they don't like this guy, and maybe they need to keep him quiet.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that if Mr. Navalny tried the same thing somewhere in Western Europe, for example, making a film about corruption of a prime minister or some leading businessman, he would be in jail in no time. So on this, as regards this particular thing, I would say that Mr. Navalny is enjoying quite a lot of freedom in Russia. I would even tell you that some people in Russia suspect that he's actually in cahoots with the Kremlin, because otherwise how can you explain that he's got so much publicity and so much freedom and can do basically whatever he wants? I mean, let's imagine somebody doing a film about the prime minister of some Western country and accusing him of corruption. That is remarkable by any chance. But what I'd like to make a point about is that the important thing is that the protests did take place in Russia. They took place in several cities, which I can't say, for example, about some countries in Western Europe like France, where the President Macron won a very suspicious election, where the parliamentary election is very suspicious as well.
But we're getting a bit diverted now.
You would expect...
Sure, we're getting diverted. Let's focus. Let's keep our focus on Russia. And fair enough, you want to give analogies, right? Mr. Nekrasov, to answer my question directly, is Navalny a threat as an opposition member to President Vladimir Putin?
No, I think Alexei Navalny is not a threat to Putin and the government. I think he is a threat in a way to some of the oligarchs which are behaving in a strange way. But as for Putin, I don't think he's a threat. I think Putin, if he runs next year, he will win without any problems. So we are just witnessing a certain nervousness on the part of the authorities, which are doing things sometimes I think they shouldn't be doing. I think they should not be dealing with protests in the way they did. But the police forces all over the world do that. So unfortunately, it's the reality of modern life.
Okay. Oleg Kozlovsky. Now, granted, my source for this poll was RT, right? I'm gonna grant that. But they say that Navalny was polling at 2%, and there's absolutely no chance he would have any chance at the presidency come next year. Digging a bit deeper, there's a YouTube video which shows Mr. Navalny comparing Muslim immigrants to cockroaches on a YouTube video in a promo for a Russian pro-gun law. With all of that in mind, he doesn't seem to be the most progressive opposition hero that maybe some people on the outside are hoping for. Is that fair, Oleg?
No, actually, I've seen that video, and besides it was filmed about 10 years ago, and he was comparing to cockroaches burglars who would come into somebody's home. He was campaigning in favor of the right to possess guns.
But you knew what he meant by that. He was talking about immigrants, right?
Or
he wasn't talking about burglary, he was talking about immigrants.
No, he wasn't. It was a video about a completely different issue. So anybody who would say it is about migrants either didn't watch this video or just outright lying. So you should just watch it yourself.
I don't speak Russian. I'm taking other people's interpretations.
It should be somewhere with English subtitles.
Okay, fair enough. Polling at 2%. Tell me.
Speaking of his, his polling. Yeah, I've seen the same figures, and I think it's probably something around that. But we have to consider that Navalny, at the moment, is claimed to be barred from elections at all. So people who say they want to vote for Navalny are the ones who believe that he will be on the ballot in the first place.
Yeah, but nobody's putting a gun to their heads, right? Nobody's putting a gun to their heads and saying, hey, who are you going to vote for in the election? This is just asking people their opinion, and only 2% said they support him. So how on earth is he going to overturn Vladimir Putin in a presidential election?
It's quite simple. Most people don't believe he's going to be allowed to run. So what's the point of saying I'm going to vote for the guy who will not even be on the ballot? So they mentioned Zyuganov or Zhirinovsky, the two people who are considered a kind of loyal opposition. So this is why Navalny is ranked 4th, I think, after Putin, Zyuganov, and Zhirinovsky. But the very moment if Navalny is allowed to run, I think this figure will change, because more people will see that, wow, now we have somebody from the real opposition on the ballot, so we should reconsider our choice. And in 2013, Navalny ran for the mayor of Moscow. In June that year, he had polls gave him about 2 or 3% of support among Moscovites. In September, it was 27% by official count. So he managed to increase his support 9-fold. And it's not granted that he won't be able to do this again. But even though I personally would not bet that he's going to win, even if he's allowed to run, even if he ranks second, it will change the Russian political system completely, because for the first time it will be the real opposition, not the loyal opposition, that will claim that it represents a significant part of the Russian population. And Putin will not be able to ignore calls for democracy anymore.
Okay, so Alexander Nekrasov, interesting point there. Why not support a real opposition, not the loyal opposition, no matter how small the numbers are right now? And they're standing on platforms like anti-corruption. You agree corruption's a problem, so why not throw your weight behind these guys who are trying to make incremental change?
Well, first of all, the opposition in Russia is split, it's divided, it's got no program to offer, and Mr. Navalny basically, apart from his anti-corruption stance, he offers nothing. So it's a one-issue opposition, you know, like UKIP in Britain, which had one issue, and now it's gone. UKIP is gone now in Britain. It's the same with Mr. Navalny, because when you don't offer anything apart from this battle with corruption, okay, we accept corruption is a problem, but corruption is a problem in every country, not just Russia. So that is why I don't see any future for him, because he's got no program. I agree in a certain way that he doesn't have access to a lot of media, he doesn't have the same publicity as the other opposition leaders or Putin, but you see, he has to have a program, a manifesto, and he's lacking that. And until he has something specific to offer people in the economy, in social welfare, nobody's going to listen to him. It's going to be this small protest minority who will protest anyway.
Okay.
See? So that
good
doesn't
point.
work like this.
Okay, so let's get a final comment from Oleg. Oleg, your leader's a one-issue man. He's a one-trick pony. What else does he have?
Well, I would disagree with that. Of course, while corruption stands big in his program, what he offers is a political reform, and this is the first thing that has to be completed in Russia, at least in my belief, before any other reforms can be seriously addressed and other issues tackled. So Navalny clearly stands for a more democratic, more liberal system with separation of powers, with no censorship, etc., etc. This is a big thing. It will require several years to complete.
Okay, gentlemen, I've got to move on. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you, Alexander Nekrasov and Oleg Kozlovsky. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
China and other South China Sea Rim countries have agreed to a framework of conduct to resolve a maritime dispute dating back decades. But critics say it's just a delaying tactic by China, and that Beijing has no plans of backing down on its claims in the region. The dispute over maritime claims in the South China Sea in the modern era began in 1911. That's when Chinese naval forces carried out surveys of the Spratly Islands to preempt occupation by French colonial forces. Since then, the dispute has continued and shows no sign of ending. It's of staggering international importance because nearly $5 trillion worth of goods are transported through its waters each year. The sea is also estimated to hold billions of tons of oil and gas reserves. China calls it the new Persian Gulf and has been boosting its naval strength here. Those claiming the waters also include Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei and the Philippines. Taiwan also says it holds rights in the area. That's something China does not acknowledge, given its position that Taipei administers a renegade province. Beijing also says that it controls the area within its designated 9-dash line, which effectively covers almost all the maritime territory of the disputed waters. But the remaining South China Sea Rim nations contest this, calling it strong arming of their legitimate rights to exclusive economic zones in the waters. They cite the internationally recognised United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, or UNCLOS, as basis. The Philippines took the matter to an international court for arbitration in 2016, winning its case. The ruling was unenforced though, as Beijing has refused to accept the jurisdiction of the court. The US presents that as an argument to maintain a heavy naval presence in the region to protect its allies and keep the Middle Kingdom's ambitions in check. That's something that China has strongly protested against, and that's why it continues to bolster its own military presence in the region.
Le premier tour des élections législatives.
The first round of the parliamentary elections is marked by the unprecedented decline of the leftists, and in particular the socialists.
Et notamment du Parti socialiste.
French President Emmanuel Macron's winning streak is continuing unabated. His centrist party is on track to securing a huge majority in the French parliament after Sunday's first round of voting. Macron's 16-month-old political party and its allies won a combined 32% of the vote, significantly more than the established centre-right Republicans. But the scale of the victory was marred by low voter turnout, with less than half of eligible voters showing up to the polls. Despite the smaller-than-expected mandate, Macron and his party are set to gain a commanding majority in the French parliament, where he hopes to push aside the political establishment. Part of that old order is France's socialists, the party of former President François Hollande. They finished near the bottom and are expected to lose at least 200 seats. Most of the party's old guard were voted out in the first round, including its leader, who lost the Paris seat he held for 20 years. Well, I'm joined now from Paris by French journalist Pierre Hasky. He's the author of The Right to Happiness, which contemplates the key issues facing France. Good to talk to you once more, sir. Fascinating results that came through. Hello. Were those results surprising to you?
Well, it was by its scale. Actually, what is going on in France at the moment only happens through revolutions, usually. You know, a whole establishment has been almost destroyed and sent to retirement. But this happened through democratic elections. And this is quite staggering by the scale of it and also by the way it is being done. You know, most of the candidates who are going to be elected in the second round next Sunday are totally unknown to the general public, and they only get elected because they have the support of Mr. Macron. People campaign in the streets, and the citizens tell them, oh, you are the representative of Mr. Macron, I will vote for you, although they don't know anything about them. This is the type of things that is happening and which is changing the whole political landscape.
Now, you say revolution. Usually when there's a revolution, it's because people are extremely passionate one way or the other, either on the left or the right. What we're seeing here, based on all the available evidence, is that with a 49% turnout, those on the left or those on the right didn't show up. They didn't feel the need to go to the polls. And when it's a revolution, we're talking about a centrist revolution. What's going on there? Is there apathy on the left and the right?
It is indeed a centrist revolution, which is almost a contradiction in terms. What has happened is that voters, including part of the voters of the far right and the far left in the presidential election, behave as if they give Mr. Macron a chance. You know, the first months of Mr. Macron have been almost, it's like a plebiscite in the country. People have been very happy with the way the mood has changed in the country, and particularly his behavior on the international scene. You know, his meetings with Donald Trump, with Vladimir Putin, his reaction to the US getting out of the Paris climate agreement. All these have been really welcomed by the French public, and a lot of people are just thinking, okay, let's give him a chance, even if we don't agree with him, but at least there might be something good out of it. That's really the mood in the country at the moment.
A firm handshake can give you a lot of political capital, it seems. Let's talk about the socialists for a moment. From a socialist president to people saying this is the death of the socialists. What's going on? Are the socialists finished?
I think so. I think the Socialist Party, as we've known it, is finished in the sense that it's lost its reason for being. You know, the Socialists are completely stuck between, on one side, the reformist agenda of Mr. Macron and the radical agenda of Mr. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was the presidential candidate for the far right. Mr. Mélenchon has managed to kill the socialists from the left, and Mr. Macron has killed it from the center. And today, the socialists who have a heavy weight to carry, which is the legacy of Mr. Hollande, whose presidency was very unpopular, have lost the strength of their message. It will take years for them to reconstruct probably a new party, maybe under a new name, but definitely with a new program.
Mm-hmm. So we know that Hamon definitely, didn't resonate with people during the elections a month ago. Mélenchon didn't make it. A lot of his supporters are apathetic right now. What does it mean for the left? Are there any figures on the French left who might be charismatic enough in order to revive the left right now?
So you have Mr. Mélenchon, who will probably be elected next Sunday in Marseille and will be a key figure in the new assembly, one of the few opposition figures in front of 400 and something members of parliament for En Marche, the party of Mr. Macron. And Mélenchon wants to be the person who will incarnate the left. But there is still room, I think, for a social democratic left that for the moment doesn't have any personality to defend it. And that's probably what is going to happen in the next few months. There are some clubs that are being formed by some of the figures of the Socialist Party to try to think a new strategy and a new positioning for the socialists. And I think that's what's at stake for them, is either they reinvent themselves or they disappear completely.
A month ago, the far right and their candidate, Marine Le Pen, thought that they were a few steps away from the presidency. What's going to happen to the far right now? Surely they're not just going to roll over and die, so how is this going to play out?
They're not going to die, but they are in a difficult position because not only did they lose the presidential election, which most people really expected to happen, but they lost it in a bad way, in the sense that the debate between Marine Le Pen, their candidate, and Emmanuel Macron was a big blow for them because they saw their candidate in a weak position, and it was almost humiliating for her. And I think a lot of voters on the far right have abstained this time because they've lost confidence in their leadership and in what their party represents. And there is another problem, is that Marine Le Pen had a key issue in her program was leaving the euro, the currency, the euro. And that proved very unpopular in France. Many people who, because she, believed that she didn't have an alternative strategy. And how can you destroy the economic system if you don't have an alternative strategy? Mm-hmm. And that has weakened her. Now, obviously, the reasons for her popularity, the big divide between the have and the have-not in France, the winners and the losers of globalization, this has not disappeared and will not disappear overnight. So there is still room for the far right to reorganize and win support if, and that's a big if Mr. Macron doesn't succeed in showing everybody in France that his economic policies are inclusive, that he will not accept to have part of the country left on the side of the road.
Yeah, you said there's a feel-good factor. So clearly, he's done all the right things in terms of the symbolism. He's got a parliament that largely backs him. How long will the French people give him before they start complaining? So whether it's the economy or anything else, how much time does he have?
It's a good question. It's a bit an unknown quantity. The first test will be very soon, actually. In a few weeks' time, there will be an attempt to reform labor laws. And that's a very sensitive issue in France because people are always very touchy when you touch social benefits that have been accumulated over the years. And Mr. Macron wants to reform in a very deep way the labor laws. Only a few months ago, we had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets complaining about attempts to change those labor laws. So now in Parliament, you won't have a strong opposition to it because Mr. Macron has a large majority. If he doesn't handle very well the unions who are powerful in France and public opinion at large, he might have the first tests of his authority and his popularity. But if he does well, you know, everybody knows, and people voted for him in the knowledge that he was going to reform labor laws, and that gives him, obviously, some legitimacy to do it. So his political skill will be tested in the next few weeks.
Pierre Haskey, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Next time, we debate whether the GCC conflict could spell disaster for Hamas. But for now, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.